Take it
All
away,
right.
John.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on rental regimes and occupational fees. But before we start, I just want to go through a bit of some housekeeping on our webinar. So our next one is on Monday, the 17th. We will not have a webinar. That's been combined in with the 20th. So on the 20th, we're having insulated concrete forms, but we're also including foundations and specifically focusing on the role of crawl spaces and how to build crawl spaces to building codes. Most of the homes have crawl spaces, so this will be important with that. But we will be releasing a pre-recorded webinar that's called Training First Nation Building Officers. So what's training is available for building officers, a bit of a history of the training, and how our training is working with municipal building officials and the home inspection sector. And then we are thinking down the road for our next set of webinars for the new fiscal year. And we're now looking at the idea of the first Monday of every month, we will have a webinar, we're going to call it, Stories by You. So somebody can organize an issue. So if you have an issue from your community, you will let us know. And you can present 1 or 2 or 3 slides, whatever, and you can share it with the group. And we're set up some, help the terms such as let us know a week before, and then we'll find an expert that if Claude and I can't have it, we'll bring in like an engineer, and we will cover those costs if we have to pay an expert to come on to help address your issues. So keep in mind, stories by you, and that way people can discuss from the ground up of the challenges that you're having, on building and even on housing policies, anything in the housing construction renovations area. So that's a bit of housekeeping. All right. So today's on rental regimes and occupational standards, or occupational fees, building code stuff. All right. How come my screen's not moving? There we go. So today I want to focus a little bit on how do we move towards rental regimes. So I want to talk about a change to management thinking. How do we move from status quo? Since my involvement in housing, so I would say that's late 1990s, this topic has always been front and center. How do we charge rent? How do we collect rent? How do we do all this stuff, right? So how do we change the thinking? I also want to talk about, is housing a treaty right? And does this prevent rent collection? I want to talk a bit about shelter allowance, the minimum revenue contributions, what is a rental regime? Even more important, what is rent? I want to give you 3 examples, 3 case studies to show the impact of rent collections on the budgets. I also want to talk about payment and evictions, as well as other source materials to help people trying to understand more of rental regimes or policies that exist out there. Oh, there we go. But before from a change management idea, people have a tough time changing, right? And this infographic, I find it's quite comical, because in the area of sports, right, you have Leaf diehards and you have Canadian diehards, and people are always a diehard. It doesn't matter how bad your team is doing. People don't change. They're always rah, rah, rah. So for example, recently the Blue Jays, I had tickets for game 3, and I had somewhat of a bag packed, and maybe I jinxed it by putting my bus pass on the door so I wouldn't forget it. So maybe I jinxed the come from behind after an 8-1 lead. So, but this graphic is quite comical in the sense of here's this fellow, why he jumped from being a Leaf to a Canadian fan. And he goes through a bunch of numbers, right? He looks at team performances, and you can see how the Canadians have a better goal differential, the amount, the trends. He also looks at other numbers, the cost for a ticket, you know, uh, playoffs qualifications, and operating budgets. So he basically shows that I can now change from being a Leaf fan to a Canadian fan based on this information that's given to us. And when we go into rental regimes, it's the information that we need to also take, similar to this Leaf fan, to understanding how do we change rent. So one of the ways from change management perspective is what information, what data, what information is available to me to show we need to make that change. So we take a housing department, and all these are general operating, objectives, right? Improve housing conditions, better housing for our children, accountability for both the tenants and the council, the responsibility of the housing department, the tenants' responsibilities, try to repair the homes in timely manners, new home investments, and housing should be safe for everyone. And these were objectives that, I've gathered over the years of reviewing different housing policies. So from a change housing conditions, so how do we do that, or what to include? Well, first of all, you have to introduce, I know people have concerns about calling it rent, but for sake of terminology, call it an occupancy fee. Call it a fee that is required to sustain the budget of the house, right? And why? Well, you know, there's nothing really new I can talk about here. Why do you want to collect an occupational fee, right? Well, you have to pay for repairs and maintenance. You have to pay for staff to make those repairs and maintenance. If you call in a private contractor to repair a roof, well, you need that money, right? You need to repay any chiefs and councils money that they borrowed to improve the house. You need to generate additional revenues to reinvest in community housing stock. So we also talked about the life cycle, right? We know that water conditioner or the water heater needs to be replaced after, generally 15 years, right? So you need to have the money to do that. Windows have to be replaced. Roofs have to be replaced. Appliances have to be replaced. Toilet repairs have to be replaced. So you need to collect a revenue source to repair those future costs. And most importantly, prevents chief and councilors taking money from other areas, right, such as education and recreation, to offset subsidized housing. But the big thing about changing from rent is we need to address the mystique and the false assumptions impacting housing and rent. And that is, housing may not be a treaty right. SA is not a housing program. So let's look at the big question. Is housing a treaty right? Well, one of the underlying discussions or debates about First Nation housing is whether housing is treated right. So we have First Nation members, right? They view, and rightly so, it's a view that housing is treated right, and therefore it's up to the federal government. They have a fiduciary duty to provide free housing on reserve for all status Indians. And we know that the federal government's position is that they do not have fiduciary duty. There's not a treaty or an Aboriginal right, and housing is provided as a matter of social policy. And we know throughout, the last several years that there has been a number of treaty rights that have been sustained. So for example, right, the courts have determined, yes, there's a treaty right to hunt, to fish, to gather, to earn a moderate living. We know that there's a for land. So how do we get into the modern treaty? So there's a number of positions that where there was unjust or harms against Aboriginal communities, there's been a move and a legal discourse or a legal case put forward to change and challenge that for the Crown, and the courts have ruled. They also have ruled against gambling and a number of instances where they say it's not an Aboriginal right. So the courts, the communities have put forward and made the argument for treaty rights. When you look at treaty rights to housing, it has not been tested in courts. Matter of fact, it has not, from our research, not been subject to any treaty negotiation. It's not written in any treaties. So, for example, if you take Treaty 6, and if you read it, the word housing comes up 3 times. Twice reference to Jasper House, and the third time in reference to the house, referring to the Indian agent house. And in the house, there would be a medicine chest available to the community. And that's how we have, for example, health for Indigenous communities, and why it's free, because that was all part of the treaty rights. If you look at academics and people who, like myself, who are strong proponents of Indigenous rights, and people write papers and discuss these things about violations of rights by the Crown. To my knowledge, and based on my research, there has been no brief at all, a legal brief to discuss that, hey, there is a court challenge here on housing as treaty right. So what happens is that we're into this, area of stagnation, right? So we have politically discussions, housing's a treaty right, and we have community members say, oh, yes, you're right, the housing is free. But then politically, they're caught in the crossroads, because they say, well, housing's a treaty right, but we need to collect rent because we need to offset that. So then the chief or the leaders go back and say, well, we need to charge rent. And then the community members say, well, we can't charge rent because we believe in you as a treaty right. So we have this tautological argument that feeds into itself. And what we see what's happening is that we don't see housing improving. And regardless what the debate that you have, whether or not housing is treaty right, it's not free, right? And we know that people who work in housing, we know that people who understand housing is not free, right? The chief and council, as we're discussed, has to borrow money and it's much more higher rates than people off reserve will pay. And you have to borrow the money to pay for those houses. And what's happening, we know that many communities to say, look, we know this discussion of housing is treaty right, but we're moving on. We have introduced a housing regime where people must pay rent. And these communities have succeeded in implementing rental regimes. And as a result, we know that they have improved housing conditions, they have money to reinvest in their community, and we get into this whole thing of the economics and future investments in these communities is demonstrated by better housing, better support. So those communities that have gone past this discourse of treaty rights are doing extremely well. Those communities that are on this conversation have not gone past it and cannot get into the mode of, well, okay, yes, we believe housing is a treaty right. There are no court cases. Our treaty doesn't say housing is treaty right, but now we have to try to pay. And I see that when I go to communities and give presentations and talk to leaders who in fact say, on the side, yes, we know it's not a treaty right, but we want to push the argument. Granted, I agree with that, but at the end of the day, the communities aren't moving forward based on this conversation. So who pays for housing? Well, as I mentioned, band councils, right? They develop a plan, and based on the need, they try to seek funds. INAC provides money as a base funds for construction, which can be used for some repairs and for some smaller projects. You can require financing under Section 95, and we know that to address Section 86 of the Indian Act, they've introduced the ministerial loan guarantees, which basically, right, the council takes on the mortgage, and they have to make monthly payments plus interest. And if those payments are failed, the minister has a loan guarantee to overcome those communities that don't pay, which is a very low percentage, by the way. The failure of the ministerial loan guarantees, I think it's like what 0.7. I think it's around 1%, extremely low. And if no payments from community members, then the whole entire community pays. So what happens, right? So you have, and again, it's been my experience. You go to community, you talk about rental regimes, and you say, well, I can pay, but what if that person doesn't pay? And if that person doesn't pay, why am I paying? And so you have the, defaults because not everybody buys into the system because of, as I discussed, some believe it's a treaty right. They listen to the leaders, or at least they listen because they like what they're hearing in this case. So again, it gets all very convoluted. But what happens, right? It's not free. And we know because housing is not free, the chief and council has to come up with the money to make the payments for mortgages. So roofs aren't free, right? And we know that. And regardless of what people believe, it's not free. And we have that discussion. Even people off reserve, I know in conversations, people say, oh, they get free housing. Well, in fact, as we know, it's not free, right? And what happens, right, if rent's not being paid, you get this spiraling deficit tunnel, and you go into more debt, And we know from our research that this deficits relating to housing generally leads to third-party management for many communities, and it's driven through residential housing because of the cost. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, the whole fairness, right? So everybody has to pay, everybody needs to buy into it. And one of the issues that we came across is that where people say we're okay to pay rent, and then when we were talking with some of the elders and some of the people in the community, they said, well, how do you pay rent? And basically what our discussion evolved to is, how do you do budgeting, and how does a budget work, and how do you budget for rent, and the whole challenge of budgeting. And we had a previous webinar about this on rent and financing. And what we found was that communities that are trying to move to a rental regime, you have to offset that with a budgeting course or budgeting program, because that becomes the challenge of how do you budget for rent. And yes, you may not be able to do X, you may not be able to Y, because you need the X amount of money at the end of the day. You have to make the sacrifice to pay that rental payment. So one of the big issues that's always discussed in rent is shelter allowance. And as we know, shelter allowance is a program of last resort for on-reserve income assistance programs, and it provides basic needs to eligible individuals and families to cover hydro, utilities, fuel, maintenance cost, and a loan payment under certain conditions, right? So, I remember when people were looking at, mortgages, and one of the organizations was saying, well, if you go and get a mortgage, and if you can't make the payments for a house, well, shelter will offset that cost. And one of the areas of the expertise I have is actually in shelter in a very bizarre way. And when you look at the regulations of shelter, which is dovetailed with the provincial regulations, you may have one mortgage payment covered, but by the second one, they're telling you to sell your house. So to offset shelter as mortgage payments, none of the provincial regulations allow for that. Maybe a community may offset that cost, but they're doing that out of their pocket and outside of the shelter requirements. So SA is not a housing program. It's meant to help and provide support. And as I mentioned, is based on renters' income and is based on the market rent for the unit. One of the problems with shelter is that if rent is not being paid within the communities, then you can't offset that rental payment within the community. So if you don't have and we'll talk about later, a rental regime that is solidified within the community, and somebody is in an individual's house, not a Section 95, which is solely based on SA, and that person runs a hard time, if there was a rental regime, he could theoretically also receive shelter. I know many communities base Section 95 homes based on shelter. So one way to increase your housing stock is what communities do, say, well, we're going to apply for Section 95 home because we know a family of four, for example, we can get $800 as our minimum revenue contribution, and we could use that money to offset a Section 95 house. And that's really not the purpose of SA, but First Nation communities have actually used that as a form to get Section 95 housing. Why? Because I understand you need to increase your housing stock. They use an SA as a form to do that. And the problem, what happens there is if the provincial government rolls back the amount of SA for a family, then all of a sudden you're running a deficit on your minimum revenue contribution. And that's happened in BC, and I believe it's happened in Ontario as well. So when you build an SA to buy into Section 95s, be aware that could backfire, and it has. Minimum revenue contributions. So under Section 95, under the Canadian Housing Act, or the National Housing Act, they allow for a subsidy. And basically the MRC ensures that First Nations can make a reasonable contribution towards the operating costs of a Section 95 house, while leaving the control of the rental structure to the individual. So I use the word rental because it's not rent, it's a payment which is sort of supposed to be based on the rental structure within the community, right? So the methods to determine MRC, it varies from regions, but essentially it's amount on agreed payment that is charged or should be charged to offset the cost of that house. So basically it's the project subsidy, the loan payment plus operational cost, the benchmarks, and the minimum revenue contribution. So what's operational cost? Insurance, administration staff, maintenance, utilities, water, sewage, snow removal, garbage removal. And it also includes, which is very seldom charged, a contingency of 3 to 5%. So that's how the minimum revenue contribution is charged. And it sort of is based on theoretically a rental structure within the community. But because there's no rental structure, it's based on that ownership or that occupant of that one building. So what is a rental regime? Well, this has been a big discussion for years. So I was involved in some of the earlier shelter research back in, 1990, 93. And it was through the research that I was doing that we identified many of the challenges associated to shelter. And one is, what is a rental regime? So look in reference to their manual on income assistance, a universal community-wide rental regime lays out the rights and responsibilities of the parties to a rental agreement, including terms and rental rates that are consistent with the residential tenancy laws in the province or territories. For it to be considered fully implemented, a rental regime must be applied to all band-owned homes on the reserve, regardless of tenancy. The rental regime must be incorporated as part of the First Nation housing policy through band bylaws. Okay, so what does that mean, right? Well, first of all, it has to be pretty well charged. So if you're in a community that is close to an urban center, those rental rates have to be somewhat similar to what's being charged off reserve, on reserve. It also you have to have a housing policy that basically mimics a provincial residential policy, provincial territories policies. So if you look at the housing policies that FNNBOA developed as a template, a lot of that mimics provincial tenancy legislation, with few exceptions, right? Rather than court for challenges, we talk about mediations, but it mimics pretty close. The next one is the rental regime has to be incorporated as part of the housing bylaws. I do not know of how many communities actually have, there are some, I think it's probably a very small percentage, I would say probably less than 5%, that actually have their housing policies that have been incorporated into the community's bylaws. So community rental regime policy, it must apply to all residents, including private landholders. It must describe the collection terms, conditions, etc. For the rent for the year. The collection of rent of the home that have mortgages paid has to be paid. So one of the things I find quite interesting is communities, once a Section 95 house is paid out, they stop collecting the minimum revenue contributions. And for the life of me, I understand it, but I can't understand why they do that, because that's a home that is continues to be maintained as part of the band council's asset, and it has to be paid for and continue minimum revenue contribution. I also have a lot of questions of how those homes are being sold for $1 back to the individuals, which is actually a band asset, which should be sold back at a more of a market value, which is a whole other conversation. But what I'm getting at is that these policies have to be consistent for SA, for mortgages where homes have been paid out, and for individuals that rent their homes. So if I have a home in the community and I decide to move to another community and I rent my home, and as I mentioned, that person goes into hard times, that person will get the SA if there's a rental regime. So again, private homes, they have to be supported by certificate of possessions or local tickets for absentee landlords. Again, there's a number of conditions that's set out, right? And again, for Section 95s, it doesn't matter if a home has already been paid out the mortgage or not, that funds still must be maintained and be collected for a full rental regime to take place. So provinces that don't require rental regimes, So, for example, what happens, right, is that there's supposed to be landlord tenancy boards, and where you don't have that, they're expected, the First Nation communities, to establish a similar type of market agency board to address landlord dispute resolution. So again, they set out clearly what a rental regime has to take place. And when you look at the requirements, arm length relationship, basically we're talking about housing authorities, are the checks and balances built in the system. So all these conditions that ISK raises for rental regime, very few communities can meet these requirements and therefore don't have a rental regime. So how does rent work off reserve? Okay, basically there's two systems, right? The majority of people who rent obtain their housing from a private market, which is for profit driven, and is generally determined by a balance of supply and demand. And we can see, if you listen to the radio, and because of COVID and housing, for example, in downtown Toronto, people who are paying low rents are being evicted so they can turn those homes over, for the excuse that my family's moving in, or etc. So we know that this has been an issue because there's not enough rental units right now in Canada. And there's also the social market operated by not-for-profit rental housing, and they dampen their rents and provide housing standard, but they have better secure terms. So when I was living in Carleton, or living in Ottawa going to school, I actually rented in a social housing, so my rent was lower, but I was also obligated to make sure the laundry room was clean. If you see litter in the hall, you had to pick it up, and you sort of had to take ownership of the building, pick up garbage, and etc. So you become, take on that responsibility. And we know that off reserve, where individuals can't afford their rent, again, they can apply for social assistance. And where rent is being charged, you must provide a copy of the rental agreement to have that social assistance offset that rent. So again, many of the rental regime issues that the last few slides are reflected on an off-reserve rental system. So as I mentioned, shelter is a big player, and it's based on a formula. The same formula that is used for off reserve, which are embedded in provincial regulations, are applied to the same as on reserve as well. So what I find interesting is you want to establish, right, theoretically, a rental regime, right? Like communities want to do that because why? Well, you have consistent rental tenancy. You have clear policies. You have, a clear flow of everybody's paying rent. There's no exceptions. It applies for all members, right? You incorporate housing policy through band bylaws. And what's happening is the failure, I believe, the failure to establish a rental regime disqualifies many people who are falling upon hard time to receive shelter. So, right, shelter is basically based on a Section 95. You don't get your rent offset because the rent's not being covered. But if you had it, you can offset their rent. And people who do not live in Section 95s can apply and should qualify under a community-wide rental regime. So what we learned so far, right? Well, how do we move from status quo to better community, to better the housing for the family, for the people living in the homes. Like, how do we do that? We know that, our housing is not a treaty right, and it's not written in these treaties, and it's never been put through the courts. So knowing that, and it could change tomorrow. Somebody can find a document, or there could be a complete change tomorrow. But as we know now, that doesn't exist. We know that the band, right, they have to borrow money and to make interest payments. And we also know that they're paying much higher rates than people off reserve. And we also know that rental regimes, or where rents are not being paid, it's a major contributor to debt within the community, and it's a large contributor to third-party management. So housing's not free, right? And how do we get past that? So, basic question. So what is rent? Well, it's a payment to the housing department to live in a home owned by the community or by the band. It's a monthly payment, usually due the first of each month, and it should cover the cost of the maintenance, the mortgage payment associated with the house. So it's just not, band has a mortgage payment of $800, so that's the rent. We will show that there's also other cost that has to cover that. And rental, basically the tenant's responsible for all the utilities, personal content. They're responsible to have their own insurance, and they are required, or at least through the agreements that you have, they have to do basic home maintenance. So you don't call the housing department to change the light bulbs on a Saturday night. Light bulbs, furnace filters are the responsibility of the tenants. Tenant contracts agreements, they state that you can live in the house providing payments are made, and it's clear that all the people in the parties understand what those are. So who pays for rent? Well, it should be everybody in a band home, should be people who lived in a Section 95 and are where there's no mortgage, they should continue to pay. People who work independently should pay. People who are on social assistance should be paying, but obviously their rates won't be the same. I know in some of the communities that people who work for the band are charged a rental fee. So the question is, okay, because you work for the band, you have to pay for that home. But is that really fair when people who are living in the community should also be paying for their rent? So we have a bit of a discriminatory practice taking place in those cases. And we know that community councils can't afford to live, in the homes without making the payment. So what happens, right? If there's you have people that take on a responsibility versus those who take on the responsibility. And how do you, form a collective that everybody says we need to pay. We need to pay. We need to change our spending habits. We need to create a cash flow to offset the cost for the houses. All right. Okay, man. So the question is, how do you set rent? So how do you determine how much a rent should be? I've established there's about 9 sets of ways you can set rent. So one, you can do it by the number of bedrooms. You can do it by a square footage. You can do it based on the provincial SA rates. So if you're a family of 4, and it's $850, you can, say we can use that number. You can charge what adjacent communities are charging. So if somebody's charging, $1,200 and it's the same condition of the home, same proximity, you should be able to charge, pretty close to that fee. You can charge it based on the minimum revenue contribution plus administration and operating fees. You can, if the mortgage payment is 800, you can, for example, do 800 plus 1%. I will show that you should do, 5%. And basically the condition of the home according to outstanding debt charges. So the debt charge is the debt on the house, that's the carrying cost. So if you have a house that has a debt, then that should be one of the conditions that you could also charge, right? INAC requires for shelter allowance agreements or for the universal regime. So if you're setting rent, again, it has to be consistent for all the homes. And you can have different homes. So Section 95 house, and people will pay X, people in another community will pay Y. It doesn't have to be carte blanche. Everybody pays $800. It has to be fair and reasonable. On the other hand, a rental regime is saying, well, everybody pays $5. And that's not acceptable either, because that's not within fair and equitable and within a housing standard. So you have to be conscientious of there's going to be diversity within the community, but you can't just say everybody pays $1. And what are the benefits to rental regime, rental collections, right? Obviously, you get to pay for the mortgage, you get to pay for the maintenance, you're able to make maintenance repairs in timely manners, right? You get to plan the maintenance. There's ability to effectively respond to emergency repair calls. Like, how many times do we know of, oh, well, the X is broken. Well, we can't do that because we don't have the money, or we have to wait for next month. So, or we know that we're 15 years into a water heater, so we're going to have a program. We're going to replace the water heaters whether or not they need it, and we're going to do that every 15 years because we have the money we've been saving, right? You can hire a contractor to make the repairs. You can credit score the personal finances to borrow. So what happens, right? People, and we talk about credit scores, which is a challenge in First Nations because of employment, and you don't have a mortgage, but a rental regime will allow a person to create a credit score. So they want to go to borrow money for a truck from a bank. Then if they're paying their rents, you can establish a credit score. Revenues from rent can be levied by the council to borrow against other monies to build homes. So again, you can use it to increase your housing stock. You can increase it to invest back into the housing infrastructure. I think important is the home is who you are and not just where you are, right? So we have to also change the discourse of, it's just a house. Well, it is just a house, but we need to invest in the house, and we need to look after the investment, because we know through our studies that the life cycle of a house is 6 years, right? And what that means, after 6 years, you're putting in major repairs into the house. Where my house is 1928, and I can tell you 1, 2, 3, my roof's been repaired approximately 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times since 1928. And I repaired it once, and I don't expect to do it probably in another maybe 10 years from now. But I am saving up because it's going to cost me about $30,000. So I have another account that I put in for roof repair. So not collecting rent, what's the impact? Well, we know that, those that are working hard to pay the rent and others don't. So you have this contradiction occurring in the community. Some are paying their rent and others don't. Well, why don't they pay? Well, I know in many cases they have the funds. The household makes very good money. They work in the forestry industry, but they're arguing that housing is a treaty right, so therefore we're not going to do that because the chief has said it, and we agree. Not that they agree all the time with the chief, but they agree with that comment. We know, for example, that it's also an election campaign. We know in one community where a community spent years, they introduced a really good rental regime. A new chief came in and said, if you vote for me, I will cancel the rental regime. So they voted for the chief and they got rid of the rental regime. What happened? The community that was basically extremely well went into a deficit and almost third-party management just a few years later. We know that there's no additional revenues, right? So you can't hire people to, do the maintenance. There's a higher borrowing cost. The system's broken. You can't maintain a house. So this generally is what's happening by and large in a lot of the communities. So I want to go through 3 scenarios. This is based on a community where we looked at the numbers, and just to show what happens where rent and no rent is being paid. So this community had 14 new homes. And these 14 new homes, they were actually based on Section 95 housing. There is no new builds, no INAC or private homes. And the shelter was actually quite low in these communities. It was $360 per month. There were 175 homes that were mortgage free. So these were, as I mentioned, SA homes that have been paid out. People are living in it, but there's no revenues being collected. So based on the 360, they are bringing in total revenues of $60,480. But we know, right, that there's operational cost. So we know that the mortgage payments, which the SA was based on in this community, so they based it on the minimum revenue contribution was based on the mortgage payment. In this case, it was $660,180. But we also know that you need to do your set-asides, right? So the set-asides, we are going to be 4% rule. You set aside for ongoing maintenance for all 189 homes. So, right, windows, doors, furnace, appliances, water tanks. That set aside should be in the kitty of $34,020. And we know insurance is quite expensive. And so that was 378. So basically the bottom line, right? The total operational expenses is 473, 60,000, and they're at an operational deficit per year of $412,020. Like that is a huge number year after year after year. So they're just spiraling into a major debt. So what happens on scenario 2? All right, so you're not changing the 14 at 360 because that's part of the minimum revenue contribution, but why not go out and charge $325 for the 175 homes? So just look at that number. You're pulling in $682,000, approximately $683,000. So all of a sudden, wow, you have a contribution revenue of $743,000. Your expenses don't change, right? You still have the mortgage payments, right, of $60,000. You still have that 4% rule, and you still have the insurance cost. So basically, you take the expenses less the revenues. So you have an operation deficit. Well, you don't have an operation deficit. You have a positive of $270,480. Like that's huge. If you do that year after year, do the math. You're going to have substantial revenues within the housing department. Let's take it one step further. So under scenario 3, we take the 14 homes and we add the 4% of the operating cost. That works out to $14.40 per month. So you go back to the people and say, the occupants, and say, all right, you have to pay $14.40 more. Same, you get the 14, the 375 per month. So you get a little bit of increase on the total revenues, right? The operating expense difference. But what happens by adding that $14.40 a month? You increase your revenues by 272,899.20. So what's the difference, right? So basically $2,000. $2,000 will buy a lot of duct tape, right? A lot of, small repairs. So just by adding that $14.40, you're able to bring in some extra money, like, doorknobs, extra. So are there communities that charge rent? Kigazibi, they have a complete rental regime, and they have over 2.5 million in their housing accounts to build new housing, and they build new housing. Onion Lake had one. I'm not sure what's happening there now, but you can see there's other communities that basically have variations of rental that they're pulling in. So yes, is housing a treaty right? Well, the treaty doesn't say that. We like the argument. I believe in the argument. However, it doesn't, it impacts the cost or the rent. So on the issue of rent, how do we do that, right? And again, I know through the courses that we're teaching through the First Nation Housing Professional Association, the stuff that Candace's group is doing, and the stuff that we've been doing, right? And we see this happening now. The level of housing department scale is improving, and it's fantastic, right? So now we're starting to see signed contracts. We see processes to address issues for disagreement, how to arbitrate. So this is happening now as we've taken place. It's fantastic, right? So we're moving mountains here over the last few years with departments doing this. And by doing this, we can also start pushing more towards rental regimes, right? So, and one of the courses that we actually have online is how to provide home maintenance, right? So we know in the past, before COVID, people who are being provided with a house, they are required to take a home maintenance program. And we actually have a video online that rather than having Claude or me or an inspector go in, we now have a video that should be a mandatory viewing for housing occupants. And I make reference to that at the end here. So the big issue, payments, arrears, and evictions, right? And how many times I've heard it from the council, well, they don't pay rent, it goes to chief and council. The council is not going to evict a family member or a friend of the community, and it goes on and on and on. That's why you need a housing authority, an independent body to address payment arrears and evictions, right? And so we talk about how to address it, meet with the housing department, talk about how it's going to be fixed. It should be done by the housing staff or third party for transparency. The chief and council should not be stick handling anything to do with payment arrears and evictions. Quickly, some core documents, they're on our website. The tenant responsible, including home maintenance repairs, that I believe all tenants should be watching. Is the references down below. When you get the link, you should be able to click onto that. We talk about rent. This is not the musical, a podcast. Roxanne Harper gives an excellent explanation about rent. And again, there's a number of podcasts and tools that the housing managers can make reference to, or feel free to share with chief and councils and community members. So basically, do not look back, ask why, look forward and ask why not. So that's how to try to move forward with the rental regimes. I know it's a challenge. I understand the dynamics, but we need to encourage and provide support to everybody to move in that direction. Questions, comments? And I can't see the chat, Claude, so.
Okay, Jessica Cliff, are you still there? Did you want to provide a little commentary on your chat posts here about BC housing?
Yeah, because the subsidized housing, we have there's 4 complexes here in Campbell River, but there's such a long wait list. What they've done is they've offered people who rent and they're working and have kids, they will pay for 30% of their rent. They just deposit it into their bank account.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, interesting to say that. I know that some communities, they have like incentive programs, right? And that is for communities that pay their rent on time and, the first of the month, they don't miss a payment. They go for a draw, and it could be like an appliance, like a microwave or something. It's fairly substantial. And so that encourages people to make their payments through, mainly electronic payments or bringing the checks. And so I know that that's been an interesting program to encourage timely rental payments.
Any other comments out there? John, maybe one from me.
Yep.
I've done a lot of work with Habitat, and as we know, Habitat for Humanity, the people that are going to become we'll call it the new homeowners, generally have to put in a certain number of hours in. I think we've also looked at in our other tenant webinar discussions, the issue of, we'll call it sort of in-kind work offered towards maybe subsidizing people that are challenged with, let's say, rent payments.
Mm-hmm. Good question. I open the floor to see if anybody's tried that. I know, again, I mentioned I had to do that as part of my living in a co-op housing. I had to make sure, and everybody had to make sure. And our building was spotless, right? But I'd be interested to see if anybody has tried to do the in-kind contribution. Yeah.
I guess not at this point, or at least none among us at this time. So
Yeah.
I guess we could almost call it a wrap.
That's good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.